Hello everybody, this is Dawn with Painted Willow Art, and I have got another paint along for you today. But I will be honest, I don't have a picture to show you before we start because I'm making this one up. We're gonna wing it as we go and see what happens. And there's a couple of reasons that I'm doing that. One is that the idea came from about 5 different places. I saw a number of different pictures and I liked bits and pieces of each one, so we're going to put them all together and see what we get. And the other reason I'm doing it is because I want to show you how okay it is to play. You do not have to sit down with a concrete idea before you start creating. It is completely okay to start with a general idea and see where it takes you. So that's what we're going to do today. It is going to be a little bit Valentine themed. So if it turns out good, might be something you could do on a Valentine card if you wanted to, or gift the painting to somebody if you wanted to. So for this one, supplies are going to be similar to what we use on most of the rest of the projects. Because again, I don't want you to feel like you have to go out and buy a lot of expensive supplies to do this. I want you to think about what you have and how could you do it with what you have. I'm using watercolor as usual. However, you could use crayons, you could use colored pencils, you could use acrylic paints. You could do this with pretty much any medium, I think. Again, that's part of the play. We'll see as we go along, but I really think this particular project will lend itself well to just about any medium. So I'm starting with my Strathmore 400 acrylic paper. And I've talked about this in other videos. This is just my paper of choice, even though I'm using watercolor paint. So I want you to think about supplies as well. Just because a supply is meant for one specific thing does not necessarily mean that's the only way to use it. This paper is designed for acrylic paints. It's a thicker paper designed to stand up to the weight of acrylics. However, I like it because being as thick as it is, it doesn't warp as badly with watercolor. And it's got a linen finish, which gives an interesting texture. Watercolor paints do move on it differently than they do on regular watercolor paper. So if you try this paper and you're used to regular watercolor paper, I would recommend playing a little bit before you sit down to do, finished painting, maybe something that you want to give somebody, something like that, because the paints do move on it differently. But I love the linen finish and the texture that gives, and I like the thickness of this paper. So I'm starting with a 9x12 piece of Strathmore 400 acrylic paper. I've got it taped down to my canvas board as usual. Oh. Okay, I'm going to pause you for a minute and come back because, oh, catastrophe, I spilled my paint. I'll be right back after I clean that up. All right, let's try this again, shall we? I could have edited that out, but I decided not to because that's the reality. Art's messy sometimes. I'll explain what those cups of paint are here in just a minute. So, as I was saying, I have my 9x12 piece of Strathmore 400 acrylic paper taped to a canvas board like I usually do. I like these because they're nice and portable. I've generally got 4 or 5 of these going at one time, and I can just move them aside, stack them up. They move around really easily, so I like those. I'm going to use a 1-inch wide, 1-inch wide, I had to measure it, a 1-inch wide flat watercolor brush because we're going to do some big swatches of color. So it's going to be easier to do bigger swatches with a wider brush. I am probably also going to use my round number 8 at some point. Pencil and eraser, black colored pencil, black marker, my favorite Josie Lewis set, and I may, depending on how this goes, I may use some paint pens on top of this. So I will talk about alternative to paint pens. So if you don't have any of these, there are options, other things you can do, and I'll talk about that when we get to that point. The other thing I want to show you is that I have pre-mixed some cups of paint. Because I want to do big swaths of paint on this paper, and I'm going to use this big wide brush. You'll notice that this big wide brush does not fit in my palette very well. It takes up almost 2 pans of paint. So it's going to be hard to get the paint out of there if I'm painting straight from the palette like I usually do. So instead, I've mixed up the 3 colors that I want to use for the big swatches. I am also going to use some red on a heart, but it's not a great big patch of paint, so I'll probably do that like I usually do out of my palette. But I wanted to have these available so that I have plenty of paint ready to go and I don't have to mess with trying to get this big huge brush in this little palette. So how did I do this? I have these weird little plastic cups that I ended up with, I don't know, 20 years ago, 10 years ago maybe, I don't know, long time ago. And I use them for mixing paint like this, and I reuse them and I reuse them and I reuse them, and I love them for that. You could do this with little glass jars, little bowls, any kind of little dish that you can put some water and paint in. And what I did was put just a little bit of water in the bottom, and I like to use my little pipette, so I squeezed up about 4 different droppers worth of water and put it in there in each of those. And then I used my round brush to just swirl the paint around, you know, get it wet, swirl that paint around, pick up a bunch of paint on the brush, and then go dip it in that water. And you just keep doing that until the color you end up with is the vibrancy that you want. So I did that with purple, I did it with pink, and I did it with my blue. So I'm going to set these back over here for a minute till we get to those so that I hopefully don't knock them over again. And I would recommend for this project, if you have a blow dryer or heat gun, something like that, have that handy too, because we're going to need to be drying each of these swaths of paint in between, because I don't want them to mix and mingle like we usually do on projects. I want them to maintain their individual color, but I do want to layer them over the top of each other. So you will need a blow dryer. If you don't have a blow dryer or a heat gun, as you do this, you know, do the first one with us and then pause the video, let this sit for 5 or 10 minutes, then come back to it and do it again. Watercolors fortunately dry reasonably quickly, so if you don't have a blow dryer or something like that, just let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes and dry and then come back and do the next part, okay? So I want to divide this piece of paper up into 4 very distinct areas. So I'm going to, and I'm just eyeballing this. Like I said, this is play. I really have no idea how this is going to turn out. So I'm just going to run a line down my paper like that. Doesn't have to be perfectly straight. If you'd rather it be perfectly straight and want to use a ruler, you can certainly do that. I'm going to do the same thing up at the top, the other direction, and one down here at the bottom, the other direction. So what we end up with is kind of a window looking type of thing with 6 different squares. In this one, we're going to put a heart. So in this big square, go ahead and draw you a heart as big as you want to in that square. And it can be a tall skinny heart, it can be a short fat heart, whatever kind of heart you want. Okay? I am also not going to worry about erasing my lines too much today, because we're going to do some sketchy lines over the top with the black pencil. So we should be able to cover those up well enough. So what I'm going to do is put a purple swatch in this big long section. So that's where the purple paint that I mixed up earlier is going to come into play. I am going to put just a little bit of water down first. So I'm just dipping my brush in plain water, painting that on. I'm not getting it sopping wet. I just want a little layer of water on there to help this glide a little easier. And then I'm just going to dip into that purple that I mixed and paint it all down that swatch. And I'm not worrying about whether or not it's perfectly even. I'm going to leave dark spots and light spots here and there. So I'm just going to keep going with this until I feel like I want to stop. Again, we're playing today. There's no right or wrong to this. So I think I'll stop maybe right there. So at this point, if you've got a blow dryer, go ahead and pause your video and go blow dry this so that this gets dry, because we're going to layer the pink and the blue on the top and bottom sections, but I want the purple to stay its own color. I don't want them to bloom together where two wet paints meet. So go hit this with your blow dryer. If you don't have a blow dryer, set it aside for 5 or 10 minutes and then come back, okay? I'm going to pause here and dry mine, and I'll be back in just a minute. All right. I should have mentioned before I started that you can do yours in any color you want. If you don't have purple, pink, blue, you could certainly use whatever color you want. Just take the time to mix you up a couple of little containers before you start so that your paints are ready to go. Now, you've heard me talk in other videos about how watercolor dries lighter than what it looks like when it's wet. So with this all dry, or mostly dry, it's fairly light, and I think I want it to be a little bit darker purple. So I'm going to come back and just put another coat on it. I'm not going to paint over it with water this time because I don't want to disturb this bottom layer too much. If you come back with plain water and start scrubbing back and forth on this, you're going to pull up some of this paint, and I want it to stay stuck. I just want to add some more over the top of it. So I'm not getting it wet the first time, and I'm just coming back with some more purple. And after that spilling of the paint at the beginning, starting with my paint on my white paper is like asking for trouble, isn't it? I have ruined more than one painting by slopping paint where it shouldn't be. And yet, I still do this. Okay. So we've got some more purple on there. So I'm going to go blow dry this again. If you've done a second coat on yours, go blow dry yours as well, and I'll be back in just a minute. Okay. I am back with mine dry. So you're going to continue doing this layer, layer, layer until this is as dark or as vibrant or as whatever shade you want. If you want it to be really light and pastel, then maybe only one coat is enough for you. I like the colors to be really vibrant, so multiple coats will do that. And I love that with watercolor being semi-transparent, you can see through to the layers beneath, so you get this really mottled effect. It's not a perfectly smooth layer of paint, and that's good, because that's what I want. I want it to have some character and texture looking. So I'm done with my purple. Before I go any further, I want to show you that I still have purple left. What do you do with this that you have left? Set it aside somewhere where you're not going to spill it, and just let it dry out. The nature of watercolors is that when they dry out, you can still re-wet them and reuse them. So I will set this aside out of arm's reach so I can't knock it over again. And I'm just going to let it dry out. And it's going to get kind of hard and crusty in the bottom, much like the hard pans are. And when I want to use this purple again, I'll just put some water in it, run a brush around in it, wet it back up again so that it's all liquidy, and I can use it again. So don't toss this paint when you're done with it. Just set it aside somewhere that it's out of your way, okay? So I'm going to set that well over there. And now we're going to do the same thing. Actually, I think I'm going to do my pink first. You can obviously put your colors wherever you want to. I'm going to put pink across this top. So I'm going to do just like I did with the purple. I'm going to get it a little bit wet first, but I'm not going to wet the purple part. I'm only wetting the part where there's no paint because I don't want to reactivate that purple just yet. I'm going to take the pink all the way across it, and that will reactivate the purple a little bit, but it's also going to help maintain a little bit of a sharper line there. So with my pink, and I'm just running my brush through it just to make sure that there's no pigment that's settled to the bottom, so it's all mixed up and vibrant like I want it. And I'm going to do the same thing with the pink that I did with the purple. I'm just going to paint it on. And this pink is pretty light, so I'm probably going to do 3 coats on this one maybe. So I'm just putting the pink on there, and I'm going to bring it all the way across onto the purple. And what that's going to do is give me a little bit of a different color of purple where the two cross. I'm trying to be real careful and not wet that line too terribly much because I don't want them to kind of get cloudy and mingle together. I still want to try and maintain that line of separation. All right, so at this point, pause, go blow dry yours, or set it aside, let it dry for a few minutes, and then come back. Okay, my pink is dry, and I want you to notice how uneven that paint is. It's where the paper warped and buckled, the paint kind of settled in the low spots and ran off the high spots. Again, I'm okay with that for this painting because I want to have some of that textured look. So I'm completely okay with that. And the paint being semi-transparent, when I put another coat on, I'm still going to be able to see some of this through it. So it's going to maintain that uneven look. I do want this pink more vibrant though. So I'm going to come back with another coat. And I actually think this time, because this pink ends up so light when it's watered down, I am actually going to take my round brush, get it wet, and I'm going to go straight to my palette with the pink. And I'm just going to pick up a heavier load of pink pigment and just kind of drop it in there, so that I can get that pink a little bit brighter, because I would like it to be really vibrant. And I'm just dropping a boatload of pink on there. I'm not really smushing it around yet. As soon as I get as much pigment as I want on there, I'm going to take that flat brush and smooth it back across the purple again. I just don't want to re-wet that purple too much. So I'm doing all of this where the white spot was. There we go. And now I'm going to come back with my flat brush and just drag that across. And again, I'm trying not to scrub over that line too terribly much because I still want to keep that line of separation. So I think with that, we will pause there and go dry them again. Okay, back and most of the way dry. It's not 100% dry, but I'm going to move down to the bottom block, so that will still have a little more time to dry. But I want to show you how we've still got a lot of unevenness, and that's exactly what I'm shooting for. Yet, we do have a bit of a degree of separation where the pink and the purple cross. So I am going to do the exact same thing, but with the blue down here across the bottom. So again, I'm painting on just a little bit of water, but I'm only doing it on the unpainted part of the paper. Give it a little stir to make sure there's no pigment settled to the bottom. See, I do that. I drop paint everywhere. And then I'm just going to do the same thing with the blue that I did with the pink at the top. Paint on a layer of blue. And I'm going to drag it all the way across the purple. Notice I'm dragging towards the purple, again, because I don't want to rough up this line too terribly much. I would like to maintain that line of separation. Okay, Now, I do want to show you something. So I'm going to turn the blow dryer on. It's going to be loud here for a second, but what I want you to see with this is that, and you've probably already noticed it, but I just want to address it in case it's freaking anybody out. I'm going to pull a little bit of that puddle real quick. When the paint is really wet like this and you hit it with a blow dryer, if you get the blow dryer too close to it, the paint wants to move. And that's okay. That's how we get some of this unevenness up here. So I'm gonna blow dry this in real time if you want to turn the volume down just a little bit while the blow dryer is on. But I want you to watch what the paint does. Watch how it moves and know that it's okay to tip this up, tip it to the side, move it around while you're drying it, and let that paint move around. That's what gives you some of the interesting stuff, okay? Real quick, because of the way my paper buckled, all of this blue is staying up here and it's not got very much down here. So I'm just going to take my finger and kind of swipe it around a little bit. Let that get wet down there so that as I'm blowing it dry, more of that paint will go that way. Okay. Okay, so that paint moved around a little bit with the blow dryer, that the air pushing on it, but that's okay. That's what gives us that mottled textured look. So I'm going to do the same thing with the blue I did with the other two. I'm going to do one more coat on it just so that it's nice and bright. I'm not going to get it wet this time though. I'm just going to come straight back into my paint and splop some more paint on there. And I'm going to pull it back across that purple so that I get that overlap. And the overlap, it's not changing the color like really drastically, but it is going to give it just a little bit of a different shade by having those two colors overlapping. Okay, I think that's good. So let's blow them dry again. Be back in a second. Okay. Back with my three colors. I am going to paint my heart red. So for this, I'm just going to go straight to my palette. I'm not going to worry about watering it down or, creating any in the little cup. And I'm just going to paint my red straight on here. I do want it to have that uneven look though, so I'm not going to worry about trying to get it really, really smooth. And again, like I said at the beginning, you can do yours whatever colors you want to. If you want your heart to be purple and these to be yellow and orange, absolutely do that. Play around with your colors and see how they look. See what they do. See how they play together, or don't, as the case may be. And even though I'm not doing it here, I have mentioned before, I'm not doing it simply because of lack of space with the camera. But certainly if it's more comfortable to paint some of these curves and angles by turning your paper, turn your paper so that it's at an angle that's comfortable for you. Now, once I've got my red on here, I am going to come back with a clean brush. I just rinsed my brush out and dried it ever so slightly. And I'm going to drag some of this red back towards the middle. And you might have to rinse off your brush and dry it ever so slightly a couple of times to do this, because that red is pretty vibrant, and as it picks it up and starts to move it, you might end up dragging some back. So I'm just rinsing off my brush, wipe it on my paper real quick, and pull some of that red paint back towards the center of the heart. And what we're doing is creating kind of a lighter highlight over here. Now, depending on what that looks like when you do it, if you want to come back with a little bit of red right around the edge, certainly do that. Just make sure that you come back with a little bit of water on your brush and kind of feather that edge out just a little bit. So we should end up with one side a little bit lighter than the other. And again, the way I did that was after I painted it all on, I rinsed my brush and I dry it off a little bit by just wiping it on the paper next to me. I've got paper on my table. And then wipe the brush across the paint. Wipe it off if you need to. Wipe it across the paint. If you need to clean it again, wipe it, come back and do it again. So essentially what we're doing is just picking up some of that paint that we originally put down and moving it back towards the center of the heart, or pulling it off completely. You can see I've got some red splotches over here from, you know, wiping that brush off, pulling a little bit of it back off completely. So that gives us just a little bit of a highlight on one side of that heart. So let's take a pause here, blow dry that so that everything's dry, and then we'll come back and do the embellishing, okay? Okay, so everything's dry. What do you think? We're at that hot mess stage? Yep, I think we're at that hot mess stage. That point where you look at it and go, oh, I'm just not seeing it. But bear with me. Trust me, my friends. It'll be beautiful by the time we're done. So, this is where our colored pencil comes in. We're going to take this colored pencil and accentuate the lines between our colors. And we're going to do it just kind of sketchy. So if it's a little uneven, perfectly fine. Deliberately make it a little bit uneven. And just go top to bottom where that purple is. Now I'm going to turn this sideways so I have a better angle. And I'm going to do the same thing across the pink. Sketchy, sketchy, right across. Same thing down here for the blue. Sketchy, sketchy, right across. So that already helps, doesn't it? So what do you do if you don't have a black colored pencil? You could certainly do this with a marker. You could do it with a paint pen. You could do it with a crayon. Anything like that would work. We're just going for something that gives us kind of a sketchy line as opposed to something real straight and solid. I want it to be kind of messy. And if you want it to be messier still, you can come back and add a little more messy to it. There we go. Now the Sharpie comes in, and we're going to work on the heart a little bit with the Sharpie. So I'm going to outline my heart with the Sharpie. And this is where, if you can see pencil lines, you can cover them up. I'm going to go around my whole heart. And when I come back down this side, I'm going to bring this line in and curl it around. Which side you do that on really doesn't make any difference. Hopefully you can see this. See what I did? So whether you do it on this side or this side really doesn't make any difference. You choose which side you want to do it on. Now, we're going to take this Sharpie and we're going to add some more lines around the outside, and we're going to kind of make them overlap each other. And I'm going to turn you a little bit sideways just so it's an easier angle for me. So what do I mean by that? I mean, I'm going to put another line that kind of comes like this, and maybe another line that kind of comes like this. And I'm going to do the same thing off this other side. And I think 3 or 4 of those should be enough. You decide based on how big your paper is, how much space you have. I've still got a little bit of space, so I think I might come out one more. On both sides. And I think down here at the bottom, I'm going to put a little curly down there too, just so it kind of finishes it off. So with these messy lines, we're going to come back in and fill them in with designs. So I'm just going to cross hatch this one. So I'm just going to put straight lines in there. And I'm going to keep them fairly close together. And I'm just filling in this segment of this line. So I'm just going to go to the point that that line crosses another one and stop. And maybe this little segment over here, I'm going to black that one in completely. So we're just going to go around to some of these little segments that were created by those lines overlapping and add little bits to them in the form of basic shapes and lines. Maybe on this one, I'm going to do some dots. And I'm going to vary the size of my dots to fit the size of that space. So you can see I was smaller down here where the space was narrower. As it gets bigger, my dots are getting bigger. They're not quite going edge to edge, but almost. And then they'll get smaller as I come back up in here again. And maybe up here, I'm going to do some zigzags, kind of like a zigzag stitch when you sew. And maybe we'll do some zigzags down here. So you put yours wherever you want them. If these aren't shapes you like, you can use other shapes. You could use swirlies, you could use, instead of dots, you could do little squares, triangles. You decide what you want this to look like. You could even do something like this, where you're just following that same shape top to bottom and filling it in vertically instead of the short lines like this. Where else do I want to do that? I think I'm going to black in this one up at the top. So we're just kind of letting our creativity go. Let your eye tell you which spaces you think you should completely black in, or put marks in, or leave open. There really is no right or wrong answer to this. You're just kind of playing with it. And you can see the more of these things you add to it, the better it looks, I think, anyway. And I think I'm going to do one more little blacked in spot right here on mine. And maybe some more little lines right here. This is where sometimes I have a hard time stopping. How much is too much? So maybe I'll stop there. Okay. Now we're going to continue adding to this heart. I think, and actually, okay, back up for a second. We did these messy lines around the outside. I'm going to do a little bit of that on this curly Q too, because now that I look at this, it's looking a little out of place with the way the rest of this looks. And that's the nature of playing with your art. I told you when we started, I had kind of a conglomeration of 5 different images in mind, not really knowing where this was going to go. So as I work on this and I look at this, this starts to look out of place to me just because of what we've done out here. So I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'm just going to add kind of some random lines to that. And I'm going to do basically the same thing. I'm just going to fill them in here and there with different shapes like we did on the outside. So if you want to do the same to yours, go ahead. If you think yours looks fine as it is, that's perfectly fine too. Your eye is the guide. What looks good to you and what doesn't. To me, that just felt out of place, like it needed something. So we're giving it a little something to make it blend in with the rest of the heart. That to me looks more cohesive. Yes? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is add some danglies over here on the light side. So whichever side you did as your light side, that's the best place to add the danglies. But if you haven't painted your heart very dark, if it's not really, really, really deep red and you can still see your black pen, you can do it on either side. If your heart is really, really dark red, or maybe you've used a deep burgundy or something like that, and your black pen's not showing up real well, if you have a white pen, you can use a white pen to do it instead. Mine's fairly light, so I'm going to do it this way. And what I'm going to do to make these danglies is just use basic shapes. So I'm going to start with maybe a circle, and another circle, and another circle. And then from up here at the top, one of the inside lines here, I'm just going to run kind of a little squiggly line down through them, and I'm going to end with a curly on the bottom. And I think I'm going to put dots in the middle just to give it a little something. And then I'm going to do another one next to it. Maybe this one's going to have a diamond and maybe a couple little boxes. And again, I'm just going to run that curly line through and leave something like that on the bottom. So we're just putting in, think like beads dangling on a chain. We're just putting in different random things. Maybe I want to put a heart on this one. And I'm going to let this line be really curvy. Do them at different heights. So mine are feeling a little too close to the same height. So I'm going to come off of this one and add some more curlies on the bottom to make it a little bit longer. And you will continue to add those until it feels reasonably full across that side of your heart. How many you get will depend on how big your heart is to begin with and the size of pen you're using. So the size of my heart and the size of my Sharpie, 4 across there is about all I'm going to get. And that's perfectly fine. Okay. Now, if you want to, you can add something dangling off your little curly Q here. Again, I think I'm going to put another little heart over here. And I'm going to make that do that. Now, if you want ideas for what to make your little danglies look like, if you go on Pinterest and search, I think just call it dangles, D-A-N-G-L-E-S, or Zentangle dangles, you'll see a ton of ideas for this kind of thing right here. Okay, so we're done with that part. Let me adjust my camera here real quick. Okay, so we've got the heart done, but the rest of this is looking a little plain, yes? So what do you think we should do on the rest of this? I think maybe we'll make these two squares look a little bit like screens with holes in them. I don't know why I'm on a kick with that particular graphic right now, but I think that's what we're going to do with those. We'll see how that looks. Again, we're playing with this to see how this turns out. I'm doing ideas in these squares that are kind of coming to me as I go. You are certainly welcome to do whatever grabs you. If you think it looks like it needs flowers, you can draw some flowers on it. I kind of like this holy screen look. So to do this, I'm going to take my Sharpie and I'm going to start by making lines one direction. Doesn't matter whether you're going straight up, straight across, diagonal, you decide. I think I'm going to go horizontally and vertically on mine. So I'm just going to start by making straight lines. And here and there, as I'm making these straight lines, I'm going to leave some skip spots. And I'm going to vary where those skip spots are. So they're not all the same height. That way we don't end up with it looking like, you know, there's a straight hole here and a straight hole here. I want them to look kind of natural and organic. So I'm just kind of playing around with where the skip spots are, how big the skip spots are, and how many skip spots there are. And you'll notice I started out a little closer together here and I'm getting a little wider here. Do try and keep them reasonably similar. They don't have to be very precisely exactly the same width between each of them, just ballpark close. All the way to the edge. Now I'm going to come back across the opposite direction. And let me turn this so it's a little bit easier for my drawing angle. And as I come back across them, where the skip spots are, I'm going to skip them going this way as well. That's what's going to make it look like a hole. So I'm going to do the exact same thing I just did, only I'm paying attention to where my skip spots are. Where there's a skip spot, I'm skipping. And I am extending my line just a little bit into that skip spot so they're not ending right on the other line. That's what gives it kind of a torn look. So just continue your lines across, skipping the initial spots you skipped the first time. And it can be a little hard sometimes to keep track of your skip spots. So if you need to slow down to do this part, slow down to do this part so that you're getting them crossed and skipped appropriately. And you can see how that looks. Now it looks like it's got holes in it, right? So I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to do the same thing up in this top one. so exact same thing. I'm going to go the same direction as I did the first one, just because my eye feels like that would be visually pleasing. But certainly, if you want them going different directions, you can absolutely do that. There's no reason you can't. You get to decide what you think looks good and what you don't. Got a little carried away with the width on that one, didn't I? Whee! So I'm going to turn it around and come back the opposite direction, skipping those same skip spots. Okay, so there we go on that one. Looks like holy screen. So there's the whole of it so far. So as we continue with this, again, you decide how much you want on here, how busy you want this. It's completely up to you. I don't think I'm done yet because I really like kind of the busy doodle look yet. So I'm probably going to put some more things in these spots, but probably not as dense as those two corners because I still want to have the contrast. You know, these look kind of light compared to the corners, and I want to leave that contrast because that's what gives it some visual interest. So I'm probably going to put a little something in here. Not sure yet, so I'm going to pause you for a minute while I think about it. Okay, I've decided what I'm going to do with mine. I'm going to put some words on mine. You certainly don't have to. If you're uncomfortable with your handwriting, absolutely don't feel like you have to do this. But know this, because this is not a precise piece of art. Lines aren't exactly straight, nothing symmetrical. We're kind of whimsical. Your handwriting doesn't have to be perfect either. I'm going to put the saying on here that says you are braver than you believe, stronger than you know, or stronger than you think, and more loved than you will ever know. I'm going to handwrite mine on. Certainly you're welcome to do that as well if you want to put some words on yours. If you don't like your handwriting, here's another option for you. Find some magazines, and you can cut the words out of magazines and glue them on instead. So that's another option if you don't want to do the handwriting. If you would rather not put words on yours, certainly you could leave it as it is if you like it the way it is. If you wanted to put other doodles on it, maybe you want to put some flowers or some stars or some more hearts, whatever you want to fill in, you kind of let your imagination, your vision guide you. But I think I kind of like the idea of words on here. Now, what I have done, I'm hoping you can see, but it might be too light to be able to show you. Oh, yeah. Oh, you can get it down there a little bit. I took a pencil and real lightly penciled in where I want the words to go, just to make sure I've got my spacing the way I want it. I've talked about this before. If you draw with pencil on the paper and you watercolor over the top of it, you're probably not going to get it erased. But if you put your watercolor down first and then put pencil lightly on top, you can erase this because the pencil is on top of the watercolor. If you've put the pencil down first, the watercolor is going to seal it to the paper essentially. So I took my pencil and just kind of penciled in where I want my words to be, what I think I want them to look like. I am going to probably use both Sharpies for this because I want some of the words to be thicker and bolder. So I'm going to use a bigger Sharpie for that, and then I will go back to my extra fine Sharpie for some of the smaller words. So here's what I'm going to do with this. On this one, I want the word braver to be bigger letters. And I'm going to come back over them a second time because I want them to be thick. So I'm just going back over them kind of slightly off the original line and thickening them up a little bit. So that makes that word, you know, kind of thick and bold. And I think what I'm going to do is do all of my thick words first. So I want stronger. And I can't see very well the pencil that I did on the purple. But I'm essentially going to do it the same way. Get my word on there, and then I'm just going to come back over it and make my letters thicker. And same thing here. These are my highlight words, so I want them to be thicker and fatter than the rest. Now, this is perfect if you have experience and skills with doing hand lettering and maybe can do some fancy writing. I don't happen to have that skill. But I don't think it's absolutely required either. I think doing it this way is perfectly fine. This is my own handwriting, which gives my own touch to this piece of art. It does not have to be Pinterest perfect. Okay, so there's my thick words. And now I'm going to come back with my smaller Sharpie and fill these in. So up here, and I think I'm going to do them, I did these in cursive, so I'm going to do these more of a print style just so that they're a little bit different. And I'm not getting them exactly where I had penciled in, so I'm going to come back once I've got everything on here and just lightly erase the pencil marks that are there so that I can't see them. Okay, so I've got my words on there, and now I'm going to come back real lightly and erase that pencil. And when I say really lightly, I mean really lightly. And I'll show you my eraser here in a second to show you why. This watercolor is not sealed at this point. So if you erase too hard, try and do it without messing up my painting. If you erase too hard, I don't know if you can tell on camera, there's a little bit of pink on the eraser there. If you push too hard with that eraser, you can actually pull up some of that watercolor. And I don't want to leave eraser marks in my paint. So I'm just doing this very, very lightly. I love these Pentel high polymer erasers. These are fantastic because they work really well even with a light pressure. I use these all the time. I actually prefer these to a kneaded eraser simply because you're able to get a nice light touch with them and they still work really, really, really well. So I'm just really lightly erasing all of that pencil off the top so that I don't leave eraser marks in my paint. And there we go. I think I'm going to call mine done at that. So like I said, you guys can fill in these other spaces as you choose. If you want to do words, do words. If you want to do some other doodles, do some other doodles. If you want to leave them as they were, do that absolutely as well. I kind of like that busy look, so I tend to continue adding on mine. Sometimes I don't know when to stop, but ultimately your eye is the guide. So I'm going to pull this tape off real quick just to give us a final look at this. Remember, when you're pulling your tape off, pull it away from the paper so that if the tape does happen to rip, it's going to rip away instead of into your painting. Ugh. And do it slowly. It's always a good idea, if you're going to be taping your paper down while you're watercoloring, to test the tape that you're using on just a random scrap of that paper first, so you can get an idea how sticky the tape is and how it's going to react to the paper, so that you know whether to expect if it's going to rip or not. And this tape, this washi tape that I use, you can see it does rip a little bit, but it's not too bad. And by pulling it off away from the painting, it's not ripping into my painting, so it's not really hurting anything. And I do want to show you as well what has happened around the edges of mine. You can see up here I've got some paint up here and some paint down here and some paint down here. We used an awful lot of water on this painting, and sometimes, again, another good reason to test your tape. Sometimes the tape that I use, when it gets really, really wet, it starts to lift. And so this is where that tape lifted a little bit, and some of that really wet paint got underneath. But I'm not really concerned about that because I'm going to put this in a mat. I'm going to put it in a mat, so the mat is going to cover up this white around it. What do you do if you're not going to mat it? And you don't want, say you're just going to stick this in a 9x12 frame that doesn't have any edging to cover up that white border. You don't want these to show. If you take a white paint pen and just lightly go over those with a white paint pen, and I say lightly because it's watercolor, so watercolor can re-wet. So you don't want to go back and forth over it a bunch of times. Just hit it. Ooh. Be careful your paint pen doesn't drip. Just hit it lightly one time. Cover it up. Now, sometimes colors can still bleed through this white paint pen, so you might have to do this a couple of times, but hit it once real quick. That gets, because this is acrylic, it gets a coat over that watercolor, and then you can come back and do this again if you need to. You can kind of see where this is hopefully you can see, where it bled through the paint pen just a little bit. But at least I've got that initial coat of acrylic on it from the paint pen. I could come back over it again if I needed to recover it. But you can see in other areas it covered really pretty well. So if you don't want to put this in a mat, but you end up with little bits of paint outside your main painting, out where the tape is, you can use a white paint pen, or even if you don't have a paint pen, you could use white acrylic paint with a brush, a small brush, and do the exact same thing. Now, obviously, that doesn't work if your paper isn't white paper. If you're using a tan paper, or maybe you're doing something like this in metallics on a black piece of paper, you might need to use a different color paint, but acrylic paint will cover up those boo-boos if you don't want to have to put this in a mat. I like the idea of putting it in a mat, though. I think it gives it a really finished look if you put that in a mat. So we would end up with something like that. And that covers up all of those areas that paint bled. So I don't get too terribly excited when I have paint bleeds through my tape, because there's a couple of different ways you can use to cover that up. But I think with that, I'm going to call this good. So if you give that a try, let me know how you do. Remember to always, always, always sign your work. So people know who did it down the road. You date it. You can always look back and see how your skills have grown over time. And that's it for this one. Again, if you like what we're doing, please subscribe to the channel. That way you get notified every time we have a new paint along. I've got quite a few ideas lined up in the queue, so I'm probably going to have a new video at least every week for the next little bit. I'm going to try and keep them going every week after that, but they may stretch out just a little bit further apart, but at least for the next little bit, if you're subscribed, you will get the notification every time a new video comes out. And if you like following along here, please also follow along on either Facebook or Instagram. I'm at Painted Willow Art on both. And I also, in addition to doing paint-alongs like this to help get people creating and show you easy techniques to get you going, I do also teach using art as a meditation tool. So if you're interested in that, you can find information about that on my website at paintedwillowart.com. And with that, I will say, see you next time, everybody. Have fun.